Our next speaker was a grade school PE teacher, meaning teaching physical education to little kids, and he got lucky. During a student-teacher apprenticeship, he met one of those special, extraordinary teachers. And guess what self-revelation he came to? I stink. In order to survive, I'm going to have to get better. So what he did was he went to grad school. And in grad school, he became a researcher. He specialized in teachers and coaches. And guess what the good news is for all of us out of that? No one's born an expert teacher. It's a learned behavior. So he's going to fill us in right now how to become an expert golf instructor and coach, all the way from Athens, Georgia, Dr. Paul Schempp.
Thank you, Mike. It's a rather interesting introduction. Here's somebody who confesses to stink as a teacher, and now he's a university researcher. I'm sure that has you all on the edge of your seats. I'd like to first start by thanking the organizing committee for inviting me to speak here this morning. To stand before 1,000 of Europe's best teachers and coaches of the game of golf is an honor and a privilege. And it's my goal today to do justice to their trust and provide with you something I hope that you find beneficial, and as Mr. Sterling suggested, hopefully a little entertaining as well. And before I begin, I'd also like to thank another group, and that's the German PGA members. Thank you for inviting us to your homeland this week so we can become better professionals, better teachers and coaches of the game. But not only does your hospitality benefit us, but ultimately it's going to benefit our students and our players in the game of golf in Europe. So, zu unserer Kollegen und Freunden aus Deutschland, herzlichen Dank. Having sat in your seat where I've had to try to take copious notes of somebody who's speaking in a language I'm not particularly familiar with, I found that a difficult task. So I just wanted to tell you that I took the notes that I'm going to use today and I downloaded them to my website, www.performancemattersincorporated. If you go onto the website and go over to the presentations and scroll down to the bottom, you'll see the 7th PGA European Teaching and Coaching Summit. Just click on that and you can download all of my notes. It's free of charge. I just did it as a convenience for you. All right, I'm rather excited not only about this morning, but this conference, because I believe everybody that is in this room today shares something in common. You and I share something in common. And what that is, it's a desire to be a better teacher and coach. And as Mike told you, it's been a lifelong, or I shouldn't say a lifelong, perhaps over the past 30 years, it's been my desire to try to understand what it takes to be a great teacher or coach, because in the beginning I didn't think I was. And until this day, I still find many things in my teaching and coaching that I believe that I can improve. And so in my pursuit to become a better teacher, I thought, what better way than to go out and study the best in the business? So as the director of the Sport Instruction Research Laboratory at the University of Georgia, I have the privilege where I'm able to go and study some of the best teachers and coaches in sport today. Let me just tell you a little bit about who we've had a chance to study, because then I'm going to talk about what I have found from them, and that's what I'm going to share this morning. In golf, we've had a chance to study the Ladies Professional Golf Association Teachers and Coaches of the Year, the best that the LPGA in America has. We've also had the chance to study many of the PGA Teachers of the Year. This is the National Teachers of the Year from the United States. Randy Smith, for example, who's one of our speakers here, has been somebody that we've had the opportunity to participate in research with. And then finally, as Mike told you, my research laboratory works closely with Golf Magazine, and we help select the top 100 golf instructors in America. And that's a difficult task because in North America, there's over 48,000 certified teaching professionals in golf. And to pick 100 is a rather daunting task. We do know that when we do get that list, it represents some incredible teachers. We've had the opportunity to talk extensively with many of them. But we haven't just looked at the game of golf. We've gone outside and we've looked at other sports too. And I mention this to you only so that you know the principles that I'm sharing with you this morning don't come only from looking at golf instructors. We've had a chance to study national championship gymnastics coaches. We've studied professional baseball batting instructors. I know not a popular sport in Germany, but in the United States, rather extensive. We've studied national physical educations of the year. These are public school teachers who teach sport in America. We had a rare opportunity to go to Korea and study the only living human being that was ever declared by the government of Korea as a national cultural asset because of her knowledge of folk dance. Probably all of you have had benefit of her expertise when she helped orchestrate and design the opening ceremonies for the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul, Korea. We've also had the opportunity to study extensively experts in tennis instruction. In fact, 4 of the people that we studied are currently Davis Cup captains. We've studied American football coaches. The all-time winningest collegiate football coach in history was a subject of a recent study of ours. We've studied national and expert volleyball coaches, and we've just begun to study Olympic-level swimming coaches. And again, I mention this only because we find that these characteristics of great teachers, great coaches, are not unique to the sport we teach. So this morning, what I've decided to do is select some of the things that I think might serve you best. I'd like to talk about the stages of expertise, how we move from novices to the expert level, because I quite agree with something that Mr. Sterling said in that we can develop into better teachers. We can develop into expert coaches. It's something you learn. No one is born with innate characteristics that destine them to be a great teacher or coach. We learn everything that we need to know to be an expert coach. And there's nothing unique that you can't learn to be the best that you can be. I thought if I shared with you some of the expert teachers' teaching skills, what it is that they do on a day-to-day basis with their players and their students that make a difference, that make them different than the rest of us. And then finally, I'm going to close by talking about what you can do to develop your teaching skills. And again, I borrow these from the great teachers and coaches because they're constantly a work in progress. They don't believe that they have reached their full potential as teachers and coaches. They're always looking to get a little bit better. And so what I'll do is I'll share those strategies that they use because we can all use those. All right, let's talk about the stages of expertise. What do we move through? Well, we all begin as novice teachers, and after about 2 or 3 years, if we acquire enough knowledge and enough experience, we move into the next level. Oops, sorry about that. Move into the next level, that's competent teaching. And then finally, with more knowledge and more practice, more experience, perhaps we can become an expert teacher. All right? And I'll go through each one of those characteristics, or each one of those stages. Before I do, I'd like you to do this. Would you share with a colleague, somebody to your left, or somebody to your right, an experience that you had in your first or perhaps second year of teaching, actually teaching or coaching, an experience you had that had a profound effect that is with you today and still influences your teaching. Go ahead, take a few minutes, person to your left or to your right. Share with them an experience that you had. Our first years in the profession, the first couple of years that we're there, tend to form some of the most memorable experiences we have. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing, because many of those experiences we just as soon forget. We make a lot of mistakes in those first years. But if we use them to build on and learn from, they can be beneficial. Let me tell you some of the characteristics that a novice has, and I'm sure many of you experienced these when you were a novice, but I want to share these with you because many of you are going to work as mentor teachers. In other words, you're going to work with a student who's just coming, or a teacher who's just coming into the profession, and you need to understand that they think differently than you, and they rely on different resources than you do to improve their teaching. So in understanding these characteristics, I think you'll find it helpful in working with them. The first is that their teaching behavior tends to be rule-bound. It follows procedures, and it's rather inflexible. You watch a beginning teacher teach, and generally you're going to see that they teach all students exactly the same. They make no variations depending on the student, who the student is. For example, if they begin with the grip because they think it's important, they'll begin teaching the grip to every student they have, irrespective of the student's previous experience. So they follow procedure. When working with a beginning teacher, perhaps you can share with them some of the procedures you follow. For example, to open a lesson or to use a video, a segment to describe or analyze a student's performance, or close a lesson. Share some of those procedures that you find help you teach, because that's one thing that might help a student or a beginner. The next point is a critical point, because it is the watershed mark, in our opinion, that divides the novice teacher from a competent teacher. A novice teacher does not take responsibility for a student's failure. They normally blame the student for the failure. In other words, the student doesn't have enough athletic ability, doesn't have enough strength, flexibility. The student doesn't have enough motivation or desire. If only they'd practice, they could be better. Or that the student simply just doesn't have what it takes to be a good golfer. They don't have the interest. They should be doing something else. Anytime you hear a teacher or a coach put the blame for a student's failure on the student, I'll tell you right now, that is not going to be an expert teacher. And as we get into the levels of expertise, you'll begin to see this. All right? And I have a story that I want to relate that makes the point, but I'll do it when I get to the expert level. But it is a critical point that begins to separate the novices from the great ones. Next point. As I mentioned, they follow procedures, but they lack efficient and effective routines. So they're constantly reinventing their teaching. They constantly open the lesson in a different way or close it in a different way, or always try to find another explanation. So the lesson of a novice kind of takes on a herky-jerky approach. It's not smooth. There's no momentum to it. And this last point for novices is an important one. They learn best from experience and practical examples. Giving them a book to read, or a seminar like this, or some theories, generally won't work with novices. They've got to try it. We often find that our greatest lessons come from our greatest failures, and novices have to do that. So don't be afraid to let them fail from time to time, but then sit and talk with them about what they learned from their failure, and that's how they learn best. If you want to show them something, that's wonderful. Demonstrate it for them, and they can learn it and apply it. All right, let's move to novice or competent teachers. Generally, after about 2, 3, 4, 5 years into the profession, if the teacher or the coach has been learning and gaining knowledge, they become to the level of what we call a competent teacher. And this is the first characteristic we notice at this level. Rather than following procedures, they use a technique we call contingency planning. They start to think like this. If the student seems to understand this explanation, then I'll do this activity. If they seem confused, then I'll do that activity. This is contingency planning. In other words, it means that they're more responsive to both the student and to the learning situation. Beginners can't do that. Second point, they tend to be guided more by goals and long-term plans than the immediate responses they see. You watch a beginner teach, and they're likely going to point out all the negative things they see in a person's golf swing, and they'll jump around every time they see something new. Competent teachers don't do that. They'll have a long-range plan where they see this performer, this golfer, or this student going in the future, and they'll work towards that. So each lesson becomes part of a bigger scheme. They see the bigger picture for this player or student. That's a sign of a competent teacher. They're also able to distinguish the important from the unimportant in what they observe and what they hear from students. When I talk about the experts, I'll spend more time with that because they have a very highly developed perceptual and analytic capacity that uses this principle. Unlike the beginners, competent teachers have established routines. And so what you notice about the competent teachers that you don't see with the beginners is that the teaching has a natural, easy, almost elegant flow to it. The momentum's maintained, students' interest is maintained, and you can see progressive learning taking place. They have a sense of timing, and they're able to maintain the momentum. They have a little bit of anticipatory response, we call it. What that means is they watch the students, and they can gauge the student's interest level, the level of understanding the student has. And so they might give more information if they see the student's mastered it, or they might cut it back, or maybe even change an activity, long before the student becomes bored or frustrated. That momentum is able to keep going. And finally, unlike the beginner who learns from experience and practical examples, competent teachers learn most from others. That's why a seminar like this is absolutely critical to our development as good teachers. The people sitting to your left and to your right, in front of you and behind you, are going to be among your greatest sources of knowledge. And so I strongly encourage you to talk with these people, maybe on a personal level at first to get to know them, but then more about your professional concerns. Because I'll tell you this, there's no one else in the world who knows more about the problems and challenges you face on a daily basis than the people in this room. Use them. They're willing to do that. And I'm sure if somebody approaches you, you'd be willing to share your knowledge, because in that exchange, you're both going to be better. It's one of those cases where the whole is significantly greater than the sum of the parts. All right, another important resource for you is seminars like this, not only listening to speakers, but getting a chance to see new equipment, networking with other people, and being part of organizations like the European PGA associations. All right, let's talk about expert teachers. But before I do, I'd like you to do this. I'd like you to think about who is the greatest golf instructor that you personally know. And what characteristics do they possess that make them a great teacher of the game? And what I'd like you to do is write those down. Go ahead, take a few minutes and do that. Because essentially, this is our research question, and I'm going to share with you our answers. I'd like you to come up with your own answers. Go ahead. What characteristics does this great teacher that you know have? And after you get a couple down, share them with the person you were just talking to. See if you've got a match there. All right, now let me share with you the characteristics that we've discovered in studying the great teachers and coaches we've had the privilege to observe. And it doesn't mean that my list is any superior to yours, because if your list is going to make you a better teacher, use that. What I'm going to share with you is what we have found. Let me first go over each one of these characteristics so you get the bigger picture, and then I'm going to go over each one point by point. First of all, as Mr. Sterling suggested, expert teachers have extensive knowledge. They know more about the game, the players, and how to teach and coach this game than virtually anybody. All right. Next, they have keen analytic skills. And some research that we just recently completed kind of gave us some insights into those skills, and I'll share those with you. Their perception is finely tuned. They see the significance of things that the rest of us kind of overlook. Their perception is very keen. Next, their intuition, that gut feeling they get, is highly developed, and they rely on it a great deal to make their decisions. In fact, that's one of the keys to an expert teacher or coach, is that intuitive response. Next, they have highly developed rituals and routines. I've already mentioned that novices don't have those. Beginners are beginning to have those. But what I'm going to share with you are, especially when I get to the teaching and coaching skills, exactly what they do in terms of their rituals and routines that make a big difference for their players and their students. Next, we find that they're self-regulating. In other words, that they monitor their teaching and their coaching very closely. They know the skills that they need to most develop to even be better than they are. And again, I'm talking about the people who are the best in the world at what they do. And then finally, they have a thirst for knowledge. They'll look to any source, so I'll spend a little time with that. So just a quick review. Extensive knowledge, keen analytic skills, perception finely tuned, intuition highly developed, routines and rituals, self-regulating, and a thirst for knowledge. Look to any source. Look at your list, look at this list, see what you have found that we haven't yet found, and I'd love to hear from you about that. Okay, let's start with extensive knowledge. We find that they have extensive knowledge about 3 areas. The first is they have extensive knowledge of the game of golf. All right? And again, Mr. Serling suggested that. Next, they have extensive knowledge of their players. And finally, they have an extensive knowledge of how to communicate their knowledge of golf to their players in a way that the players can find it most usable and most effective in terms of their performance. All right. Let's take each point separately. I'm going to guess that if I asked you which of those 3 areas you have the most knowledge of, you'd say the knowledge of golf. Think about all there is to know about golf. All right? First of all, there's the skills and mechanics. There's the rules of the game, which I understand are changing. There's the mental aspects. We saw Dick Koop on the DVD. Dick, to my mind, is one of the great sports psychologists in the game of golf today and has really advanced our understanding of that field. The fact that he was at this seminar doesn't surprise me. He's a terrific person regarding that. Strategies and tactics, didactics, if you will, whole area of knowledge. Course design. In fact, it was interesting in an interview I heard not too long ago about Ben Crenshaw. He was talking about his library of books on golf course architect. And he feels that knowing about golf course architecture helps him to be a better player because he understands what the architect had in mind when he or she designed that hole. Equipment, a never-ending challenge. And Frank Thomas is going to talk more about that when he closes the session. And I see some excellent exhibits out in the hallway. And then finally, the histories and the traditions are something we can all improve on. Right? So if you look at all of the things, and I know that's not an exhaustive list, all the things there is to know about golf, our search for and our understanding of golf never has to end. But the more you know about the game of golf, the better you're able to teach it. And we found this out through our studies. Let me be very specific here. The more you know about the golf swing or the rules of golf or the strategies of golf, the better able you are of expressing to a student that concept you're trying to convey. And if the student doesn't understand it the first way you expressed it, your knowledge allows you to express it in a different way. You could, for example, explain the golf swing in so many different ways. If we asked you to stand up here on this stage and tell us all you know about the golf swing, this conference would be over before your explanation of all there is to know about a golf swing would be over. For subject experts, they find the biggest challenge in teaching is student motivation. In other words, they believe I can teach any student what I know about golf if the student's willing to learn or the student wants to learn. So what they need to know most is how motivated is this student to learn. Now, that's not the challenge that novices have. Non-experts, their greatest challenge is finding appropriate activities. I can generally tell a novice teacher without even talking to him when I watch him on the lesson tee. In 30 minutes or 40 minutes of instruction, the student never does anything different. They stand there and they hit golf balls down the driving range. ball after ball after ball. And what the novice teacher tends to do is criticize everything that the students do. All right, your grip's too tight, your takeaway's too fast, you're too much to the inside. That's a novice. All right? You watch a great teacher teach, and generally the student isn't going to do the same thing more than a couple of times in a row. Maybe they'll introduce a training aid, or maybe a practice activity, or maybe a swing modification, or maybe take the ball away completely. Many different activities so that they make sure the student understands the concept. A novice doesn't have that. A lack of knowledge of the subject area prevents them from doing so. All right, a few other things that being an expert in your subject area allows you to do. First of all, you're better at planning progressive activities so you can lead your student or your players on a successful path to ultimately where you want to go with your long-term goals and plans. You can develop contingency plans, the if-then planning. And again, only with extensive knowledge of golf can you do that. If the student understands what I'm saying, then I'll move to the next level. Because you have a passion for golf, you want to learn more about golf. It's going to be exciting for you to be here and talk with other people who share that passion. You're going to learn more when you walk into the exhibit hall and see all the new toys that there are to help you teach the game of golf. The more you read about golf, the more golf you watch, the deeper your understanding, the more enthusiastic you become, and that translates to your students. Your passion for the game of golf is infectious. It's contagious. And again, the more you know, the more passionate you become. And finally, because you know so much about this game, golf swing rules and so forth, you can accommodate a greater range of learner abilities. You can generally teach golf to young people, old people, people who are able-bodied, people who are disabled, men, women, doesn't matter. All right? The more you know about this game, the more you're able to accommodate a greater range of students. Knowledge of players. If you were to ask me what really separates good teachers from great teachers, one of the major characteristics I would give you is knowledge of players. Right? Novices often don't understand their players, and therefore, or their students, therefore, they begin to blame the student for the failure. And I've already mentioned this point, but it's because they don't understand their students, they don't know their students, that they generally look at the student's ability or motivation or their background as the reasons why the student didn't pass, all right, or didn't succeed. They seldom look to themselves as teachers, coaches. Not the expert teacher. The expert feels responsible for the learner difficulties, and because they feel responsible, they seek solutions to the problems the students encounter. And I'm going to tell you a story that happened not too long ago. It was at the PGA of America Teaching and Coaching Summit in Florida last December. One of the things that the PGA of America wants to do is a program they call Promoting the Game of Golf. And as part of that, before the teaching summit actually took place, they invited some of the golf instructors to come to Port St. Lucie, the PGA Learning Center, and give 10-minute lessons to anybody who wanted to come in and take a free lesson. It was great for somebody like myself who loves to study expert teachers and coaches. In fact, I had the opportunity to observe two of my favorite people, Craig Shanklin, who was a PGA Teacher of the Year and hails from Scotland, and Laird Small. Laird is the Director of Golf Instruction at Pebble Beach Golf Academy in Pebble Beach, California. One of the most compassionate and caring instructors I've ever met. So I was there for a couple hours watching Craig and Laird give these 10-minute lessons. Well, I went to dinner that night with Craig. Craig's always fun to go dinner with, and I don't mean to generalize about Scottish people, but I've noticed two characteristics. One is they're great at telling stories, I think as Mr. Sterling just demonstrated. And secondly, they love Guinness. So what better company to be in than somebody who drinks Guinness and will tell you lots of stories all night long. So Craig and I went out to dinner, and he seemed a little troubled, and I couldn't understand why. So a little later I said, Craig, what's bothering you? He was quiet for a minute, and he said, I could have done better. You could have done better at what, Craig? He said, do you remember that woman that came to me in the 10-minute lesson? I said, which one? He said, she's about 55 years old. Her husband had just retired. They had just moved to Florida. She didn't play golf, but her husband was a passionate golf nut, wanted to play all the time. Well, in retirement, she wanted to spend time with her husband, so she thought she might learn the game. This was her first introduction to the game. I said, okay. He said, I could have done better. I said, wait a minute, Craig, you're talking about a woman who you've never seen before, you will never see again, you had for 10 minutes, who didn't pay you a dime to teach, and you're going to lose sleep tonight because you could have done better. And his answer was this: yes. You want to know something? When Craig Shanklin got out of bed the next morning, he was a better golf instructor. Because he spent the night thinking, how can I have done better with this student? Somebody like myself who said, 10-minute lesson, not getting paid, I had no problem sleeping that late. Did I get out of bed a better teacher? No. The great ones take responsibility to do all they can for their students and their players. And I think Craig is just one example. I'm going to bring somebody up on stage who I think is another example. Peter Mattsson was the former head coach for the Swedish golf team, and he just recently accepted a position as the director of golfing for the English Golf Union. I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of great teachers and players coming out of England in the next few years, not that there already has been. But one of the strengths that I've noticed about Peter and our coaching over the years is his knowledge of players. I've seen very few coaches that use their knowledge and understanding of the players they're coaching to do a better job to reach them as a coach. And so rather than me telling you stories about how Peter has done it, I asked him if he'd be willing to come up and share some of those experiences with you. Would you welcome Peter Mattsson, please? Just have to press that.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Well, I do feel that I still have a long way to go before I could call myself an expert teacher, but I'd like to share just a couple of stories with you. Whoops. Wrong button, huh? There we go. Well, I think I need to give you a little bit of background first. As Paul just said, I was the former head coach of the Swedish golf team and the Swedish Golf Federation. The Swedish national team might be a little bit different in its setup than other national teams because it stretches basically from young boys or girls under the age of 18 up to the top professionals that we have that play the PGA Tour, the LPGA Tour, or the European Tours. I was promoted to being the head coach when I was 28 years old. And I remember thinking, all right, now what? What should I do? I went to my first European Tour event, and I met with players that I had seen on TV and that I didn't know that much about. So the only thing I could do was basically to watch. So I spent a lot of time and a lot of tournaments, getting up really early in the morning, went out to the driving range, watched players practice, prepare for their rounds. I watched their practice rounds, and that's basically all I did. And after a while, after a few tournaments, then I started to get some questions, because basically, I guess they'd seen me there a lot of time and thought that maybe I had spotted something that they could get some help from. So they started to give me some questions. And I think that what that actually meant was that having spent all that time with the players, just watching, they started to realize that I was actually somebody that cared about them. And this second one may sound a little bit like a cliche. I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. But I do think that's the way it is, because if you look at the situation on the big tours, the PGA Tour or the European Tours or the LPGA Tour, there's players practicing on the driving range, and on the back of the range there's a number of coaches, all with their great idea about how to make this player better. One of the great players that I've been fortunate enough to come close to over these years is the #1 female player in the world, Annika Sorenstam. And it's interesting to hear that she today still receives letters or comments from coaches that come up to her and say, I know how you can become a better player. And it's always something to do with her golf swing. And I'm not all that convinced that that's the thing that's going to make Annika Sorenstam better. I think there's a lot of other areas where players can improve. I think what she's done over the years that has made her a lot better player is not really changing her golf swing. I think she's changed a number of other things. On this picture here, we've got Freddie Jacobson and Niklas Fast playing table tennis. Now, what's that got to do with golf? Well, basically nothing. But this was at the World Cup at Kiao Island in 2003, I think it was. And I'm thinking, we've got two players. They couldn't be further apart in terms of their approach to the game. They're two very, very different players. Do we have anything that unites them, or that could unite them? Well, they both like to compete. They both like to challenge each other. So ping pong or table tennis could be one thing. Other sort of games or anything that could bring a little bit of joy into the evenings and maybe take their minds away from golf for a while. One of the things that we usually did with the Swedish Federation and the Swedish national team was that every British Open we rented a house, and we invited all the players to stay in this house. We brought over a Swedish chef. I was there, Paul was there a few times. We had would have a physiotherapist there. Any kind of support that players could need during a tournament. Now, if they wanted some sort of help, coaching-wise, or if they just wanted to talk, we would all be there, and the opportunity would be there. But it would be up to the player themselves to choose whether they wanted to use it or not. You coach a person and not a sport. Well, we were sitting last night in our hotel room, Paul and I, and Paul said, well, I've noticed one thing with you when you work with players. When you work with player A, you always start asking about how her family is, how's her husband, how are the kids, and all that. Whilst with player B, you never do that. And I'm thinking, why is that? And I do think that's got to do with you have to start somewhere with a player. You have to start connecting to a player some way. And I think the best way to do that is to try to really meet the player where he or she is at. Try to find some characteristics for this player. You have to know enough about the players to actually be able to start a discussion or to actually reach out to the player. Because trying to start with changing golf swings is probably going to be quite difficult. Then the last point I'd like to point out, real change comes from players, not from coaches. Well, this is actually a story in itself. One of the players, the Swedish players that today play the PGA Tour, I discovered a few years ago. This was actually when we were preparing for the 2000 World Amateur, which we played here in Germany. And our amateur side at that time in Sweden wasn't all that strong. So I did a lot of investigations and tried to look around sort of in college golf, what players that I could use for the tournament. And I was looking at Golf Week's college rankings, and there's a very, very Swedish name, because a last name that spells with 2 T's and 2 S's has got to be a Swedish name. So I looked into this guy a little bit more, called up his coach, and his coach said, yeah, he's Swedish. His parents just moved back to Sweden, and he's played high school golf over here, but now he's playing college golf, obviously. So I called this player up, and I wasn't sure whether to speak Swedish or English because he'd been in the States for a long time. So I left a message on his answering machine in English and said, please call me. And he did the night after, and we decided that I should come and see him over in the States at his college. And I didn't know what he looked like. I didn't know basically who he was. So I got out of the airplane and down towards the baggage claim, and there's this guy meeting me, and I knew right away that this could not be anybody else. He wore a Titleist cap, and he looked like a golfer. And he was a bit chubby. And we spent 2 days together there. We played some golf, we talked a lot, and had a good time together. And then after a while, I decided that I would bring him home to Sweden to play in we had amateur spots in the Scandinavian Masters, so he got an invite to play in the Scandinavian Masters. He played the European Championships, and he then played in the World Amateur for us. And the interesting thing was that after I had spent those 2 days with him, the next time I saw him was probably a couple of months later, and he was about 12 to 15 kilos lighter. And I was thinking, what happened? Because we didn't really talk about it. I didn't really say anything about it, but it was obvious that to become a better player, it would probably be a good thing for him to lose some weight. And my only interpretation of it was that I think that in his mind, it was that if he was going to be a real Swede, then he was going to be a real Swede. So he did a lot of running, and he did a lot of working out, and he became a better player. He played so much better golf this summer, or that summer and that fall. And I think the idea behind that is coaching is not necessarily what you say or the message that you deliver. I think coaching is what happens in the player. I think coaching is the result that actually comes out. And one of the things that Paul and I created together, sort of on the same basics, is, I think you're going to talk about that later. We created something that we called the Camp Excellence, which was basically a camp where the best female players from Sweden and the best male players from Sweden got to practice together for a week. And the idea with that, we wanted them to get together because, I mean, they don't get that much time to spend together. They do see each other on tournaments, but they don't talk that much. They certainly don't practice together. They don't get the opportunity to learn from each other, just like we've got the chance to learn from each other here. So we did this week, and we've done it for 2 years consecutive, and it's an unbelievable popular event because it gives a chance to the players to interact, to talk to each other. And I think that change starts and change happens when the player is ready for it and when the players really understood what change is about. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. And everything else that we've done together for the last 10 years. It's been great. All right, next point about experts is knowledge of instruction. Talked about knowledge of golf, and Peter was just telling about how important it is to understand the players. But the last area of knowledge that most expert teachers are really good at is their knowledge that allows them to convey the information they know about golf to that student in the right time, in the right way that's appropriate for that player. So what they're able to do is understand the progressions that player needs to go through and be successful. They understand the communication skills that will allow that player to really understand what it is they need to know. The player that you see there in the picture, Per-Ulrik Johansson, is somebody that is very analytic. And so he likes to look at video of his swing and constantly tries to analyze his own teaching. Other players that we work with simply never look at the video, but it works for him. And so you see one of the instructors he's working with, that's a communication skill. Drills that might be appropriate for players that are really going to make them improve. Knowledge of training aids and instructional aids. And then finally, knowledge of teaching styles and strategies. Different styles work for different players, as Peter just told you. Sometimes peer teaching helps, and that's Camp Excellence. We do a lot of that, where we have the players teach each other certain strokes. And again, these are leading PGA and LPGA players. Same thing works with beginners. Other than extensive knowledge, expert teachers have a set of analytic skills that really help separate them from novices and even competent teachers. By definition, analytic skills are the ability to identify and prioritize the strengths and weaknesses in a player's movement or a player's performance. And we just recently completed a study. We have not looked in golf instructors, but we've looked at elite volleyball coaches. And one of the differences between the expert coaches and novice coaches that we noticed is when experts analyze, they see things in rich detail, and their descriptions tend to be fairly extensive. The novices, on the other hand, use simple detail to describe what they see, and so their descriptions are fairly limited. Experts focus specifically on technical information. In other words, the information that's going to make the biggest difference in a player's performance. Novices, the descriptions tend to be fairly general. When experts analyze, their analysis is procedure-oriented. In other words, they're trying to gather the information from their observations that they can then use to help the player. Novices, on the other hand, they just simply see what they see and are able to describe it. They have no more insight into it. And finally, because of these analytic skills, the expert is able to recognize more technical weaknesses where novices detect few errors. Let me share with you something that we used with the volleyball instructors. If you notice, there's a picture of the skills called the spike.